What I'm still shocked about is the fact that both Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead universe and Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon universe share the same universe. Is Zack Snyder planning a crossover movie? Because I'm interested in seeing a crossover between Army of the Dead and Rebel Moon. Anyways, with that out of the way, hello everyone, welcome back to another Double Moon review on the channel. Technically, I've already filmed this video. This is a redo because last night my stepdad was playing loud music and I could hear the music in the background as I clearly picked a bad time to be filming this video. And I did have my Chromebook out to look at the notes I wrote down on my Letterboxd reviews for both part 1 and 2. But I don't think I'll be needing to see what I wrote on my Letterboxd reviews, as I should clearly remember specific details on what I liked and disliked about both part 1 and 2 of Rebel Moon. So, yeah, I'm gonna try and make this quick and snappy. Whatever the hell that means, but either way, I'm gonna try and make this quick. And even though I've said that in most of my videos, they would end up being long. So, let's try roll for, what, 15 minutes? So, before I talk about my thoughts on both Rebel Moon part 1 and 2, let's talk about my background knowledge on why did this pique my interest. So, a couple years ago, which was probably either 2021 or 2022, I don't know which year it was between the two, but I recall hearing about this from one of 3C Films' side flicks, which, by the way, be sure to check out 3C Films. But yeah, he brought it up on one of his side flick videos, and what really caught my attention about Rebel Moon was that this would be Zack Snyder's take on Star Wars. And apparently, if I heard correctly, he did pitch an idea to Star Wars, but they rejected him. But I was already sold in because, one, I would be a fan of Zack Snyder, despite what everyone says about him, and two, I like Star Wars. I got into Star Wars thanks to Episode 7, The Force Awakens, which, that's a story for another day. But yeah, I was sold in because I happen to be a fan of Star Wars and Zack Snyder, and I wanted to see what would have been his take on Star Wars. Now, of course, this isn't going to be like Star Wars stories, because, you know, again, they rejected him. So this would have been his original idea, but that it would have been his take on Star Wars. Now I think about it, I should try to get my dad's thoughts on both Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2, and let him know that this would have been Zack Snyder's take on Star Wars. Now, to be honest, he's probably not going to enjoy both of them, but I'm going to try have him watch them with me. But yeah, as years had gone by, finally Rebel Moon had came out on Netflix. And I do remember making a trailer reaction on the day it was released on Netflix and probably watching it later as soon as we got into Orlando. I was probably up around the middle of the night watching it. I remember trying to finish the movie before we had to go to Universal to have some fun with the roller coasters and rides were going on. And I would have made vlogs over there, but I figured why not just have fun off camera. Plus, I still need to post my day 3 to 5 Orlando vlogs, and I apologize for that. But yeah, either way, I remember watching it on my phone around the middle of the night, and overall, I was just excited to see what would have been his take on Star Wars, and haven't you have seen part 1? Not gonna lie, I was just extremely underwhelmed with it, and had a slight disappointment watching Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, which I don't understand why it's called Child of Fire. I didn't see anything about a child being on fire. But just aside, though, I don't get why it's titled that. Well, I get why Part 2 is titled Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, because, of course, The Scargiver, but Part 1, I don't know anything about Child of Fire. I have a slight trouble understanding about Part 1 title. But yeah, as I said, I felt extremely underwhelmed with Part 1. Now, I will say this. I wanted to love it, but I sadly didn't, but I didn't hate it either. Just don't know if it was good. But I do know why I felt slightly disappointed with Part 1. Now, I could say it was because I had high expectations for it, which, yes, but no. It's mainly because I kept thinking this was Star Wars, so I probably should have tried turning off my Star Wars brain for that or something. Now, I don't know how to explain properly, but basically, I know why I was disappointed with Rebel Moon Part 1. Now, I will say, if Star Wars didn't rejected his idea, I could see how, which is which. Like, for example, Jimmy, which I don't know what's his android name, could have been somewhat like C-3PO. And Motherworld would, I guess, be the Empire. And as for those cool-looking lightsabers, yeah, those things are basically just lightsabers. I don't know if they have a name in the Rebel Moon universe, but they're basically just lightsabers, just shaped as swords, I guess. Still, I could see some bits here and there, like, oh, I could see how this would be that or that or that in the Star Wars universe. But still, as I've mentioned, I might have trouble trying to explain how I mean, but basically, I am aware of how I was disappointed with part 1. But let's just talk about pros and cons with part 1. So 1, I did enjoy some of the world building that Zack Snyder did for Rebel Moon. I'm definitely interested to explore this Rebel Moon universe that, again, would be his take on Star Wars. As for characters, yeah, I did like some characters, and for the villain of the movie, General Noble, he's someone you're gonna hate for the things he does in this movie. But I will say this, I do like the actor that plays him, that, if I recall correctly, I think the last villain I saw him play was Francis in Deadpool, which I so happen to be wearing a Deadpool shirt. What a weird coincidence, huh? But again, you're definitely gonna hate his guts, especially for what he does earlier in the movie to MODOK, if you know what I mean. But the final battle he has with Korra, I will say is pretty badass, but I may prefer part 2's final battle between Korra versus Noble, which I'll bring up later. And as for action sequences, yeah, they're definitely cool at times, and the visuals, normally I don't give a crap about visuals, but hey, they happen to be one of the highlights for this movie. But those are the pros I could think of. Now let's get on with the cons. There's at least 3 I could think of. I technically have already explained why I felt slightly disappointed with this, because I kept thinking this was Star Wars and just maybe comparing it or something. But there was a twist that happened with a certain character, which I might as well bring up some spoilers. So if you guys haven't seen Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2, I would recommend checking them out and having your own opinion, as not everyone has enjoyed Part 1 and 2, because last I recall, this had a positive audience score, but I was shocked just to see that's not a great score. And look at Part 2. Ugh. Still, I'll bring up about what everyone had talked about for part 2, but if you want to check these movies out, I would stop watching this video and come back later once you watch part 1 and 2 back to back. Anyways, that's your final spoiler warning. So, this character named Kai, who I was honestly liking, and I could see him as like the Han Solo for this Rebel Moon universe, and why do characters I like have to turn out to be bad? Because he betrays them. Basically, he just sells them out for, like, a bounty. And honestly, I should have saw this coming, but I'm not a fan of this twist overall. Like, I'm just not happy about it, honestly. It kind of pissed me off that he was even bad. And the fact he was just talking about, oh, it's nice to leave this life behind, join the fight, and all that. Until a couple minutes later, oh, sorry, I lied. I just got y'all here just so I could collect the bounty, but also for a personal reason. Like, oh, come on, man. As for this other nitpick, which I might as well forgive this because, you know, now we have part 2 out. We didn't spend enough time with certain characters for this movie. I mean, it's 2 hours and 15 minutes long, but still, I mean, throughout the entire movie, we are just mainly recruiting these characters just so they could start rebellion against the Mother World. Well, we don't spend enough time with them, and I thought that kind of bugged me a bit. I was like, oh, we didn't spend enough time with these guys. Now, luckily, part 2 kind of fixes that for me, so I might let that slide. Now, even though I was disappointed at first for my first viewing, I did forgive it because, then again, it is part 1. And while I did rewatch it in preparation for part 2 coming out last week, which, by the way, I didn't meant to make this review last week, but I had to do a homework assignment, which was being a father for the weekend. Meet Isabella. Still though, I was watching part 1 and 2 back to back last week, so yeah, I am a little late on posting this review. But back to what I was trying to say. So, yeah, around my second viewing, I had a slight better time enjoying it. I mean, I liked it the first time I saw it, just was underwhelmed at times. Was like, okay, this was a little bit of a disappointment, but I'll forgive it because this is part 1. I expect part 2 to be a bit better. And, was part 2 a bit better? Thankfully, yes. Now, when part 2 was released on Netflix, I've seen so many reviews on Letterboxd, and most of them have been, like, 1.5 star or 1.5 star. Like, not everyone were enjoying Rebel Moon Part 2. They were basically declaring it one of the worst movies of 2024, and I'm like, oh, damn. What the hell's wrong with this movie, then? Now, I could say I was slightly worried about that, but I didn't let that bug me. So, once I hit play on Rebel Moon Part 2, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I had a better time watching Part 2 than I did with Part 1. And yeah, Part 2 was a little bit better than Part 1. Now, I will say, well, the first half of the movie was a bit slow, mainly because we had like a farmer montage, which I did not mind. Sort of. Around, like, once the action starts kicking in, I mean, not that I was dying of boredom or anything. I was being patient with the movie, but again, once the action kicked in, I was like, oh, let's go. About damn time. And, yeah, I was just enjoying the action non-stop throughout, I guess, the second to third act? when did the action start kicking in? Which, speaking about I should probably say this, which might confuse you, but hear me out, because this is something that Zack Snyder had basically cleared up a bit in an interview that I don't know if I can find the same clip, but, and for Rebel Moon Part 1, so you have Act 1 to 3. So, Act 1 to 2 would basically be Act 1. As for the third act of Part 1 would be the first half of the second act. As for Part 2, Act 1 to 3, the first act of Part 2 would be the other half of the second act, while Act 2 to 3 would be the third act for Part 2, if you were to combine the movies into one. Hopefully that made much sense. But anyways, let's talk about pros and cons I have for Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. So, one, as I mentioned earlier, we do get to know some characters' backstories in here that I was a bit satisfied with. And yeah, I did enjoy some of the action sequences we had. Now, I will say, Zack Snyder's got like a huge addiction when it comes to slow motion. But I will say, there were a few slow-mo action sequences that I did enjoy. I mean, Jimmy does have a cool moment in around like the final battle. And as I mentioned earlier, the final battle between Korra and Noble for Rebel Moon Part 2, I honestly enjoyed it a lot more than the final battle from Part 1. Nothing wrong with that, but if I were to choose, I'm going with Part 2, because it was just badass, especially as just fighting each other with lightsabers while sliding down as the ship is literally falling down from the sky. But as I mentioned earlier, once the action started kicking in, yeah, I could say that's what saved the movie for me, even though I was pretty much patient with, you know, it's taking its time, it being slow from, like, the first to second act of the movie. But I do have some slight negatives going on for Part 2, like, one, Zack Snyder, you're not gonna have some problems if you're gonna be killing off some characters I like in your movies. For Part 1, Ray Fisher played a character that I cannot remember his name, unfortunately. But since I happen to like Ray Fisher as an actor, especially him playing Cyborg in the Snyder Cut, I was a bit pissed off he was killed off in Part 1. I'm like, damn, Zack, what the hell? As for Part 2, there's at least 2 characters that get killed off that I get upset about. So there's this one character that is like a samurai person, I guess. She's got robotic arms and has like a cool music theme going on once her action sequences start kicking in both Part 1 and 2. But I was a bit bummed out that she got killed off. I thought she was a cool character. As for the love interest for Korra, I was worried he was getting killed off in Part 1. I should have been worried about him getting killed off in Part 2, because around the final battle, Noble shots him in the chest with a blaster gun, and at that moment I knew, oh god, he's done. There's no way. There's no way he's getting out of there alive. And just like, damn it, Zack Snyder, I actually like that dude. So yeah, I was a bit upset that some characters were killed off for both Part 1 and Part 2. As for another character that isn't killed off, but I feel like he should have had like a lot of screen time in both Part 1 and 2, and that would be Jimmy. Because he's used a lot throughout the marketing for both Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2, and he's barely in any of those movies. Now, he does have a cool action sequence in the final battle, but still, kind of wish he had a lot more screen time in both parts of Rebel Moon. But this one will probably be my biggest negative for the movie, and it's the explanation to how Korra betrayed the Mother World, and something about assassination for a princess that they did bring up in Part 1, but we get to see how the princess was assassinated in Part 2. And something just isn't clicking in my brain. I may have to rewatch it just to have a better understanding, but in Part 1, the bad guy who, I guess I could compare him to Darth Vader or something, but he's probably like the Thanos villain for Rebel Moon. He's wanting his adopted daughter back, yet he's the one that basically threw her out the window when he asked her to assassinate the princess, but then once she got the job done, he then just like, traitor, like, huh? I'm sorry, just, the whole thing just doesn't make any sense to me. If you want your adopted daughter back, then why the hell would you just throw her out like that? Like, again, something doesn't make any sense about all that. But with that being said, those are just my overall thoughts for both Part 1 and 2. For my rating for Rebel Moon Part 1, it'd be either a 7 or 7.5 out of 10. As for Part 2, yeah, I was pleased with it, so it's getting an 8 out of 10 for me. But for Part 1 and Part 2 as a whole, it's probably going to be between a 7.5 or an 8 out of 10 for me. So yeah, I was a bit worried if I was not going to like Part 2, but luckily, I had nothing to worry about. So yeah, I am interested to see what's going to be going on for the next few Rebel Moon movies, because I'm pretty sure we're getting like 4 more after Part 2, as Part 3 just got confirmed, I think, from Zack Snyder. But want to know what I would like to see? The director's cut. Actually, let me rephrase that. The Snyder cuts for both Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2. Because we got the PG-13 versions, I want to see the R-rated version. Well, I could definitely see some scenes being cut out, especially in part 2, because after Korra and damn it, I forgot his name. Because after Korra and her love interest make out, the next scene cuts to them in bed as if we just skipped an entire sex scene going on. So, yeah, Zack Snyder, where are we getting your Snyder cuts for both Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2? Because I'm expecting them to most likely be better than your PG-13 movies of Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2, but I want to see the R-rated cuts, because, like, that's something I was interested to see. What would it look like if Star Wars was rated R, even though this isn't Star Wars, which I highly doubt Star Wars is ever going to make an R-rated project. But if that happens, I will be shocked. And while not everyone may enjoy these movies, I had an okay time with them. Plus, I had to get this Funko Pop, not only for this review, but because I happen to be a Funko Pop addict. And I hope to collect the rest if I can. But with that being said, those are just my thoughts for both Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2. Be sure to let me know thoughts comments down below if you have seen both Part 1 and 2 on Netflix, which are now streaming. I'll be sure to try to get my dad's thoughts on both Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2, but something tells me I'm going to see it coming a mile away that he's going to be like... And I know my dad is watching this, but Dad, if you're watching this, you and I are going to watch these together. Because this would be Zack Snyder's take on Star Wars, which... Actually, now that I think about it, I hope you didn't watch this video because I just dumped a few spoilers for both Part 1 and 2. God dang it! Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next Double Movie Review. Peace out.